Hey guys, Paeter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about the DC Comics recently released on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. 1 month after, well, typically anyway, I'll get to that. 1 month after their original print publishing date. In each installment, I pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, heavy spoilers for any comics that I talk about, so be aware this is your first and only warning that many spoilers lie ahead. Okay, so first off, I need to explain something about how I'm going about which comics I'm talking about. Originally, Essential Issues was designed to follow the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service, which I thought was always 1 month delayed from its print publishing date. But for a few weeks now, I've been running into comics showing up given the same date as the day it actually is as far as their publishing date. So, for example, the first comic book I'm going to briefly talk about today, Superboy, the Man of Tomorrow, has a print publishing date of April 11th, 2023, but that's actually the same day it came to the digital service. Now, I'm not haunting physical comic book stores anymore, and so I can't verify one way or the other if that's the day that it actually appeared on stands or not, but you may have noticed kind of some inconsistency in the way I talk about dates and their association to the comic books that I look at. So, going forward now, what I'll be saying is that, for example, this week, we're going to take a look at comics originally released to the Ultra tier on, and then whatever date that it came out. So if you are catching this at a later date, I plan on making a version of this in podcast form, collecting all the installments of the month in a single monthly podcast. I'm already doing that much sooner to coincide with the Ultra tier release schedule over at patreon.com/spiritbladeproductions that you can access even if you're not a patron. But there's going to be a different version that's going to go out on a 6-month delay that's going to be intended as a companion for those that are on the 6-month delay tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. So anyway, all that to say, this series is ultimately meant to be a companion to those that are using one of the two available tiers on the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. And so the print publishing date isn't ultimately that relevant to me. It's the most relevant date is when these things release on a weekly basis to DC Universe Infinite, which appears to be on Tuesdays. I think that's the pattern that I'm seeing now. So anyway, right now I'm going to look at the comics released on the Ultra tier. I apologize if they don't roll them out all the same way at a 6-month delay, when they get around to it. So that might be a little bit confusing, but I'll keep an eye on that when 6 months rolls around. We're still very early in this Essential Issues series at this point, the weekly version, and of course the podcast version as well. So anyway, so right now, the comics released to DC Universe Infinite Ultra tier on April 11th, 2023. The first one is Superboy, the Man of Tomorrow, which has the dawn of DC branding, and this brings back Con-El, or Connor, the Superboy that first appeared in the Death of Superman storyline, and had a really quite a long history after that, went through a number of changes as a character, and now recently, I think in the back half of the events of Dark Crisis Infinite, was brought back to life, or out of the time stream, or out of limbo. I tried to follow the kind of the recap on Wikipedia and stuff like that, and it was really confusing. But along with Impulse would be another one of those characters from Young Justice that they brought back, but they appear to be bringing them back in a way that is evoking their very first appearances as they appeared in the late 90s. Well, I think both Impulse and this Superboy appeared in the mid to late 90s, so which is a little less jarring for Superboy, showing up in his leather jacket and his round sunglasses and his hair buzz cut on the sides and stuff, and that whole look, which he really kind of grew out of because he went through a maturing that a lot of that was part of growing up. I mean, like, he basically was kind of pseudo-adopted by Martha and Jonathan Kent, and they kind of became grandparents to him, and he went and lived back on the Kent farm for a while and had their values instilled in him, and so he really became more of a responsible and straight arrow type of character in the, I want to say, the 2000s, but as they bring him back here, he's not full-on obnoxious like he was when he first appeared with Dude and all that kind of stuff. But he's definitely, they're definitely trying to evoke that thing. I feel like some of these characters being brought back is meant to appeal to a reader like me whose heyday either was or started in the 90s as far as their comic book reading. Really, my golden era was after that. I think the period I enjoyed most was in the early to mid 2000s, somewhere around there, or late aughts, I should say. Anyway, so yeah, this I love that Connor is getting his own book, but reverting to this look and this personality or some degree of it feels wrong. It's understandable to me as a decision because, you know, Clark and Lois's son, John, is really the straight arrow Superboy. But here's the big problem with that. John is not a Superboy. They aged him up, and that's, of course, a whole thing I continue to have issues with. So I think they're trying to leverage this guy as Superboy, and they realize that they can't. They have to differentiate his personality from John. These are things that are good. These are things that are important. But I'm not. I don't. It feels like a major step backwards. And I was interested in kind of his maturing and where he came, and so. But I'm reading between the lines. I'm like, well. Is he just getting the wardrobe back? And, you know, he's not as obnoxious. So I'm not sure. But the thing is, I'm not going to stick with this comic. I think it has tons of potential for character stuff and identity struggles. You know, he is the clone of Superman and Lex Luthor's combined DNA. And they were doing some really cool stuff about him struggling with his identity and where he comes from when they started maturing the character in pre-Flashpoint continuity. But this now, it looks like they're going to be talking about the fact that he's a clone, and the opening story certainly is connected to the idea of clones, so it looks like they're going to lean into that part of who he is, but it's largely a rock'em sock'em, you know, superhero story without much heart and character, and it's all in space, and so he's interacting with weird aliens, you know, with weird body parts, and I mean, I like aliens, I like sci-fi, but I find that in comic books, when there's too many aliens, I start to lose connection with it, because, you know, how do you register emotion to the same degree in the same way that I'm going to be able to interpret when we're talking about somebody that has 3 eyes or like an oversized blank or whatever, you know? So I just tend to not connect with character stories that have to do with outer space alien characters that don't look human at all, you know? So I'm out. I'm not going to follow up anymore with Superboy, the Man of Tomorrow. Next up, Batgirls, number 16. This one released in print on March 14th, 2023. And don't have much to say about this one. I had been trying the last couple issues of this leading up to this. The art style and tone, I've decided, is just a little too whimsical and humorous for me. I love the Batgirl legacy team concept where Barbara Gordon and Cassandra Cain and Stephanie Brown, all women who have, or some of them still girls, I guess. I can't remember how old these Batgirls are supposed to be, but they've all been called Batgirl. They've all had their time as Batgirl. And rather than like having one of them rise up and forget about the others, they made this team book idea. And so I love that premise, especially with Barbara Gordon. As much as I loved Gail Simone's run with Batgirl, I ultimately conceptually prefer her as Oracle. And so her kind of being the woman in the chair to Cassandra Cain and Stephanie Brown, I think that's a really cool recipe. But the execution just tells me I'm not the intended audience for this. It's for an audience that likes comics to be more whimsical and quote-unquote fun and stuff like that. And especially with a character like Cassandra Cain, I'm just ready for something that's a little bit more brooding and dark and serious and stuff. So I do not plan on reading any more of Batgirls. Next up, Superman Lost, number 1. Now this is it's 1 out of 10, so it's a miniseries or a maxi series. This one, the print publishing date is March 14th, 2023, and it is written by the writer named Priest, who prior to this was known as Christopher Priest or Christopher J. Priest, and after doing some research, I discovered a while back that he used to write as Jim Owsley. He's been around for a long time, is actually one of the co-founders of the Milestone universe and co-creator, I believe, of Static, I want to say. And so he's been around for a long time. I am most familiar with him because of his run on Deathstroke in the New 52, which I did largely enjoy. And he tends to write stories that I find fairly character-oriented, not not super leaning into it all the time, but enough that it appeals to me as someone who likes character-driven, character-focused stories. But he also clearly is a well-read guy and likes playing around with intellectual ideas, and doesn't always write with a lot of exposition. And so, as what I was noticing, especially in this first issue, I was having to kind of really sit up straight and pay attention to really follow what was going on. It wasn't ultimately in a confusing postmodern way, but, you know, I had to think, and I like that in a comic. He also wrote the Green Lantern stories from Action Comics Weekly way back in the 80s. That's when he wrote as Jim Owsley, and I enjoyed that years ago. So it was interesting to make that connection. I don't know, about a year or two ago when I was reading his run on Deathstroke, I was like, oh, he's that guy, you know. Now, according to Wikipedia, I had to refresh my memory on this. Priest is an ordained Baptist minister who has a number of progressive Christian essays published on the site he operates called praisenet.org. Skimming his site and what I've read of his work so far, I'm thinking I probably wouldn't agree with everything he writes or believes. He does tend to maybe play around with politics a little bit more than philosophy, although the two are, you know, they overlap some. And I just tend to not be a really strongly politically aligned person. I do tend to lean toward conservative choices in voting and stuff like that, but I don't consider myself like this hardcore conservative or anything like that, you know. But I get the sense that maybe he's going to land a little bit more on the liberal side on some issues politically, and so maybe I would disagree with him some there. But I mean, like I said, I'm not really passionate about politics at all, and I suspect that probably we would align for the most part on theological issues. I mean, like the big ones anyway. So I'm confident that he's a genuine brother in Christ whose perspective I am interested in, given his really what appears to me to be thoughtfulness in his writing. And I love how he does occasionally, and I noticed in his Deathstroke run, bring his faith and his worldview into his writing in subtle ways, not beating people over the head that wouldn't want to hear that kind of thing. But I mean, his representation of Christian characters, as subtle as they might be, is you know, it's interesting. There's just something different about his writing that I think made me sit up and notice. Before I even knew he was a Christian, I was like, he's got a different voice and a different worldview, I think, being represented in his writing than I see in most other comic book writers. And so I appreciate that, and I appreciate his thoughtfulness in exploring those things. This story is about, it's called Superman Lost, and it sets up the idea that in a mission gone wrong, Superman, in what is the blink of an eye to everyone else, spends 20 years away. Now, in the first issue, they don't explain where he's been away. They just explain how it happened. But there's a gravity to how this is handled. When he comes back, he's just been away for a little bit, but he's just standing catatonic in the apartment with Lois, and she's like, Clark, what is going on? You know, and he's just like dumbfounded. And so you just get the sense that he's been through something huge. And then the bomb is dropped that he has been gone for 20 years. And so Batman shows up moments later and recounts the details of what happened that led to him getting sucked away for what seemed like just a few minutes, but apparently he lived 20 years while he was gone. Now, it's not showing his age, so maybe they are kind of confirming or affirming the idea that Clark ages more slowly or doesn't age at all. You know, there's been some question about that, I think, over the years in comics. But anyway, the gravity they give to the fact that he's been gone for 20 years, this is the kind of concept that could have been a one-shot Superman story, and then it wouldn't really ever be referenced again. But the fact that they're giving 10 issues to this says, wow, they might be doing something here, and all signs point to the fact that they are doing something here that really has some weight, some gravity to it. It's not that I think it's going to reverberate in a lot of other DC stories and Dawn of DC and stuff like that right now, but I can see it potentially being something that is definitely referred back to as a major part. In similar ways, if you're an old school fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation, to how Picard lived an entire lifetime in this kind of simulated world, and that was a very moving, emotional episode, and they refer back to it more than once, I think, in the run of the series, and then also in one or two of the movies. You know, it just really had that kind of impact. And so I can see this being that kind of story, and I would love to read that kind of thing. And I think that this also, to my memory, is the first time a self-identified Christian has ever written a Superman story. I could be wrong. Maybe I'd be reminded of something else. But to my memory right now, this is a first. And so I'm all the more interested in seeing how Superman Lost plays out based on my impressions of the first issue. Okay, next up. Also with a print date of March 14th, 2023, is DC Universe Lazarus Planet Revenge of the Gods. Yes, somehow, even though they closed out this series with Lazarus Planet Omega, this feels like, I don't know, maybe some leftovers, or my guess is that it was supposed to come out earlier and it got behind in schedule, and so it's being released after the fact, because Lazarus Planet Omega was intended to kind of close out the Lazarus Planet storyline. So, anyway, in this story, there's a Billy Batson Shazam story about people kind of being manipulated by gods and going crazy in weird ways. And the main story that kind of jumped out to me was that the gods, this is a Wonder Woman story, the gods of Olympus are dying because humans don't revere them anymore. And they out and out say that these gods find their power, their sustenance from the worship of others, the attention, the reverence of mortals. Which certainly differentiates them from the God of the Bible. But the basic idea is the gods are dying, and Wonder Woman and the Amazons might be next because they found their life and their origins. They're connected to the gods in some way. And so apparently the only way that Wonder Woman can save them is to become a goddess herself. I'm not clear on exactly why that is. But, I mean, I think it could be a premise that's ripe for pondering theological issues, but I don't like the status quo change. For me, making Wonder Woman a goddess, I think even making her just the daughter of Hippolyta and Zeus took away something from her. I really preferred her origin when she was sculpted out of clay, had her connection, of course, to the Greek gods, or is it Roman gods? I can't remember which version we're playing with here. I think it's the Greek gods. Yeah, I'm not into that. I think she's been a goddess before, and I just kind of check out. I'm just like, no, I'm not really into that. I like a superhero that has connections to ancient mythology, but once they just become another person in ancient mythology, I'm like, I don't know. I'm not into sandals and togas and stuff like that. So yeah. It also had 3 stories that were a little too compacted, a little too crunched. I've said before that I just don't like the Lazarus Planet one-shots format they've been using, so I'm content to move on. Finally, Justice Society of America number 3. This one with a print date of March 7th, 2023. And I've really been enjoying this story so far. We've got a new Huntress that is from the future, unlike the original Huntress who was from the Earth 2 Golden Age Earth, where Batman and Wonder Woman and Catwoman, all of them were allowed to age and have children and stuff. And in that continuity, originally, the concept of the Huntress was that she was the daughter of Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle. But in this reinvention of the character, she is their daughter, but not the daughter of the Golden Age Earth 2 Batman and Catwoman, but this mainstream continuity's future Batman and Catwoman. And so she's traveling back to the past, and she is part of the JSA in the future, and she's fighting off Purdegaton, which I think is how you pronounce his name, who is a classic JSA villain. I mean, way classic, like all the way back to the 40s or something like that. And he is like targeting the JSA, trying to destroy them in multiple time periods at once. We don't really know what his end game is yet, but she is bouncing through time, connecting with the JSA in different time periods, trying to prevent her whole team in the future from being killed, because that's why her time travel journey started, because her whole team got wiped out. So anyway, this is Jeff Johns, who I loved his run on JSA back in the day. He's one of my favorite comic book writers. Used to be at the top of my list. Then Gail Simone somehow, became more riveting to me. But I still love almost anything that Jeff Johns writes. And more JSA from Jeff Johns I'm going to be on board with. What was cool about this issue that was especially striking to me was the text box references to Purdegaton. They were like getting readers caught up on who he is. And it's like, this happened way back in Justice Society of America All-Star America number 35. Sorry, I said All-Star Comics number 35. And what's cool specifically to having this experience reading comics with the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. And I promise, I have no deal. I'm not being paid to say this. But what's cool about reading comics right now with this subscription service is when you've got a little box that says, hey, way back in All-Star Comics number 35, I mean, good luck figuring out a way to read that. Maybe it's in a collection that you would have to spend probably $20 to get, but it might not even be available in any kind of collection, and then you are totally out of luck. But now they can basically refer to any comic they want and know that readers that are using the DCUI subscription service can, you know what? I can totally read that comic now, because in most every case, it's going to be part of their database, you know? And so I can actually go back and read All-Star Comics 35 and see kind of the origin of Per Degaton. Now, admittedly, it's a rough read, both in terms of the writing and the artwork because of how dated it is, but it's still cool that like they can just recklessly drop all these issues knowing that they're just a few clicks away if you want to get caught up on them. And I've always appreciated getting to know the DC Universe back in the day. I just chose to latch on to the DC Universe and commit to like getting to know this universe. But it used to cost so much more to get to know it and to stay connected and up to date with its lore and its history and all that kind of stuff. Compared to now, it's so much more easier to say, I'm just going to dive in and just invest in getting to know this universe. And now I can do that in ways even that I never could before at the height of my comic book collecting. So I feel like unknowingly for decades now, comic books have been made for something like DC Universe Infinite to come along, so that now I don't have to be like frustrated when they reference something that was some other issue and like, oh crap, well I've long since missed my chance to read that book. No, not anymore. You know, I can totally be in the loop as much as I want to be, and I think that is such a cool time to be in as a comic book fan right now. But one thing that it drew my attention to, especially when you're talking about JSA, this legacy comic book property that's been around since World War II and maybe even before. If we're talking about these characters that have that kind of history, and we're saying this happened back in All-Star Comics number 35, then you go back and read this and you're like, people don't talk like this. This is ridiculous. This is cheesy, you know? And so how do you reconcile that? Well, they've had a number of reboots and stuff to reset continuity, but still, after all these reboots, they're still saying, hey, this actually happened in All-Star Comics number 35. So, you know, now, of course, you can just shrug and say, well, it's comic books, it's fiction, whatever, get on with your day. But I think as nerds, we always kind of like to be able to suspend disbelief and make it easier to pretend that somewhere in another world, this is all happening, this is all real and stuff. I think that's part of what we kind of want to enter into, even though we know we're fooling ourselves, hopefully. But how do we then make it easier to suspend disbelief? And I think what I've kind of stumbled on is a view of comics where I think of them, each comic, as an imperfect version of the true story, that there's some kind of true story behind all of this, and every time we read a comic, it's just being told in the words of whoever is writing that story. But it's not word for word exactly, you know, what was said and stuff like that, you know. So, and so I think I'm pretty comfortable with that. I mean, there's actually even a degree of parallel between that and the gospel accounts, for example, because in the, you know, the red letters of the New Testament Gospels, where we're looking at that and they put these words in red, like these are the words that Jesus actually said. Well, no, because these were written in Greek, and Jesus wasn't speaking Greek. That was the language of the Gospels, and so they were translating what Jesus said, but we don't actually have Jesus, you know, word for word. So there's consistency in how they translated those. I mean, so we have that. I'm getting off into a rabbit trail here, but anyway, I think that there's a little bit of an interesting parallel there. Okay. So let's see here. One thing that I have to say that I wasn't a big fan of in Justice Society of America number 3, which I already was seeing some of in 2, but it's really started to come out now in 3, is Dr. Fate is apparently now a teenager, and he's insecure, and he's like, hey, Huntress just said I'm going to get killed in the future. We're like going to stop that from happening, right? And I'm like, I don't really want Dr. Fate to talk like that. I can understand why they would want to do that. Dr. Fate has always been this very strong, wise, knowledgeable character. And that can, if you don't do something creative with it, get boring. And so I can understand that maybe people would at a glance say that Dr. Fate is a boring character. But I think they've been able to do some really cool things, like when Hector Hall was Dr. Fate during Jeff Johns' first run, they did some really cool things with his character, and they introduced insecurity. He wasn't awesome in all of his knowledge. In fact, the helmet itself was kind of feeding him information because it had like the spirit of Nabu or something like that, the Lord of Order that Dr. Fate is based on or has its roots in. And so there's something similar going on here. When he has the helmet on, they border his dialogue with a yellow border to say he's speaking with the authority and knowledge of Dr. Fate or whatever. But there's still this little kind of teenager that kind of pokes through his personality, and I'm not as into that. I would rather, if they wanted to have Dr. Fate have some conflict and some insecurity, to do that by giving readers, making us privy to his inner thoughts and his inner insecurities, but for him to really still come across to others as a strong character. I'm not sold on this kind of insecure teenage Dr. Fate yet, but we'll see what happens. And then also, as you can see on the cover, Dr. Midnight looks a little bit different. And I was like, who is this? In issue 3, she's referred to as Dr. Chapel. And I was like, I have never heard of this character. And at a glance, I was like, is this like demographic box checking? Because Dr. Midnight in the past has been basically a white man, and so like, okay, well, I can see them maybe wanted to get away from that since there's a lot of those in DC Comics and they want to vary things up, but I don't like demographic box checking just to check the box. It's got to be an interesting character. But then when I did a little of my own research, I realized, oh no, this character has been around, does have history with Dr. Fate. In fact, if I remember correctly from what I just sped read really quickly before recording, Dr. Midnight was Dr. Midnight. Elizabeth Chapel, I believe, is her name, and she was the protege or something of the original Golden Age Dr. Midnight. I keep saying Dr. Fate, don't I? Sorry. And so there was a group called Infinity Incorporated that was made up of a lot of the sons and daughters and stuff of the original Justice Society. And when Jeff Johns rebooted the book as JSA in the early 2000s, a number of those characters kind of became legacy Justice Society members, but they reverted back to the names that their Golden Age original mentors had, or something close to it. Her costume when she was Dr. Midnight was very different. It was like a big, blue leotard or something. And I was like, yeah, I vaguely remember when I saw that on Wikipedia, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this. I was like, yeah, the glances I saw that, I hate that costume. I was like, I'm out, And so I didn't bother looking into her history at all. But I love the fact that they are bringing back this character that has legacy, has attachment to the deep history of the DC universe. And so I'm very much looking forward to getting to know Dr. Chapel, and hopefully she has some interesting things about her character that they'll be able to bring out in the book. I do still wonder, where is Paeter Cross? That is the, I believe, Norwegian surgeon, well, at least by genetically. I think he was a very Americanized, but he was the blind surgeon that in Jeff Johns' original run became Dr. Midnight. And I thought he was really cool, because among all these other doctor this and doctor that, he was actually a surgeon. And they brought that into, he became kind of like the field medic in the big tussles of the JSA, in addition to being capable in his own right. And so I hope that they'll do something similar with this. I hope that she is a medical doctor of some kind. Maybe she's a psychologist, some other kind of doctor. I don't know. But I'm very interested to see what will happen and what will come of Dr. Chapel. Anyway, I've gone on longer than I thought, but those are that I thought I was going to. But those are all of my thoughts, I think, on comic books for now. I'd love to get your thoughts, as always, and your reactions in the comments below. Remember to check out christiangeekcentral.com for tons more content. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.